Hey lads, the first week of Mythic Plus in Season 2 of Dragonflight is almost over, so I'll go through my first impressions of that and I will rank the dungeons based on their difficulty. Let me start with some positives. First, we have a completely new dungeon pool, which I think is awesome. After you play the same dungeons for a few months as it was in previous tiers, it becomes quite redundant and having some fresh content feels really good. For the first week, we also got relatively easy affixes Storming and the new Raging. I think that was a really good move by Blizzard, not introducing some of the new harder affixes to deal with, while we still learn the new content and the new dungeons. And last but not least, it feels like many of the dungeon timers are not so strict, they're quite lenient, and it's not about timing the key because you're running out of time, it's more about timing the key if you can deal with the content and kill the bosses. I personally love this because it focuses more on your skills and execution of the dungeon, and one small mistake is not going to make it so your whole run is screwed. Let's also mention the tuning, which initially I thought it's going to be a negative, but think about it this way. So some of the bosses, some of the fights, they were very overtuned when they released. But Blizzard was very quick to address those problems, and it released several nerfs, in sometimes even 2 in a day, to make everything playable and into the state that it should be at first place. So with that said, let's go through every dungeon in the pool right now and rank them based on their difficulty. One of the hardest dungeons right now is probably Brackenhide Hollow. It did receive some nerfs, but the last boss is still relatively hard on high keys, and I see many groups having problems with the first boss, which is the Harkwalk Trio. This boss or bosses could produce a significant amount of damage for your hero to heal, and the fight has quite a few mechanics that your whole team needs to be aware of in order to successfully complete it. On top of that, the other 2 bosses are not so easy as well, especially the 3-mouth boss, and the trash is not the easiest that we could have hoped for as well, especially if you don't have a disease dispel in your party. This dungeon is now playable after the nerfs, but if you're looking for an easy key, definitely do not go there. Only go there if you're looking for a good challenge or if you have a team that's prepared to learn mechanics and meet both HPS and DPS checks throughout the dungeon. The other dungeon that I'm going to rank as very hard is Notarian Laird. This dungeon was actually unplayable when it released, especially because of the third boss, the worm boss, Naraxus. The damage output there was so big that I remember doing a plus 14, doing over 100k HPS, and that was still not enough. We couldn't even get it past phase 1. It was simply ridiculous, but Blizzard luckily nerfed that very quickly, so now it is in a playable state. However, the dungeon still remains quite hard, still because of Naraxus, which remains to be a very hard fight, although the damage output was nerfed. The last boss could also give you a lot of troubles, because it has some very important mechanics. If not done right, you can also take huge amounts of damage in that fight. And even the trash is worth mentioning, with the mobs that drop the falling rubble from the ceiling. Even on tyrannical keys, on higher keys, if you get hit by 2 of those at the same time, they will basically one-shot somebody. But at the same time, they're quite hard to dodge because there's no ground indication where the rubble is going to fall. So overall, as I said previously, this is one of the hardest dungeons, and again, if you want to run high keys or you want something easy, probably avoid this dungeon for now, as I wouldn't be surprised to see more nerfs in here, and also the fights will become easier as we get more gear and people learn the mechanics better. Next on the list is Neldara. We can easily rank Brackenhide and Notarian Laird as the hardest dungeons, but this easily takes the 3rd spot. The trash has some very hard mechanics. For example, if you don't interrupt the troll mages and they cast their spell on one of the earth elementals, the elemental will probably wipe you. There are a lot of frontals, disorients, AoE pushbacks, mini bosses, so plenty to be aware of, and all 4 bosses here are actually pretty hard in their own way. They have some pretty cool mechanics that you need to be aware of, and the DPS and HPS checks introduced in those fights could be very tight in some cases. The last boss definitely deserves a separate mention. It made it to the list of nerfs quite quickly because it was a very hard fight. On higher keys, it requires some very precise execution in order to break the shields very quickly, and the complexity of the fight skyrockets very high if you happen to not have the curse dispel in your team. I would still not rank this dungeon as the hardest one, but if you want to spam keys and you're looking for something easy, also stay out of this one for now, as we have much better options coming up in the list. Next up is Halls of Infusion. I would rank this as a mid-level difficulty dungeon, as it has some challenging bosses and some challenging trash, but they're not as hard as in the previous 3 dungeons. Lots of things to note here. The spheres at the beginning could be quite deadly. The frogs, which are present as trash and as a boss mechanic, will kill you at 10 stacks of poison if you don't have a poison dispel. There are dragons which do heavy AoE to the party. There's a gauntlet at the end before the last boss. And the bosses themselves are also quite unique and could be quite hard. The third boss has a constantly ticking aura damage that your hero has to deal with throughout the whole fight. The first couple of bosses introduce interesting DPS and HPS checks. And the last boss reintroduces the gauntlet, which you'll be surprised how many people have trouble with, especially in bugs. So I would rank this as a very interesting dungeon. If you still want the easiest ones, that's probably not the place to go, but feel free to spend some time in here as it's a lot of fun and the dungeon definitely feels doable. Basically, all of that applies to the next on the list, Vortex Pinnacle. Personally, I didn't find this dungeon to be very hard. Yes, the trash has some interesting mechanics, but once you learn what to interrupt, what to move out from, you should actually breeze through the trash quite easily. The bosses on the other hand could be quite challenging, but there's only 3 of them, and probably the second boss is the hardest, not only because of the ticking aura damage, but also people not knowing the mechanics yet. I think that once we learn how to manage the buff and the debuff in that fight, it will become significantly more easier. And then as long as you nuke the ad on the last boss as quickly as possible and you jump at the correct moment, this one is pretty easy as well. I would still rank this dungeon as a mid difficulty one, but more leaning towards the easy side of things. So if you get the chance to run some keys in here, definitely consider that as an option. All 3 dungeons left on the list I would consider to be easy, so if you're looking to run easy keys or push to a high level, definitely consider all 3 of these. Starting with Underrop, which could be a little bit daunting at first look. The trash has so many various mobs with frontals, AoE silences, curses, cleaves, purges, fixates, even tentacles that come out of the ground and slap you from nowhere. But it all comes down to learning what each mob does and how to handle it. Once you do that, there's nothing to be afraid of in this dungeon. Absolutely the same thing is true for the bosses. Second boss looks very scary, but as long as you step on all the larvae and you pop a defensive or healing cooldown during the tantrum, this boss becomes pretty close to a target dummy. Same for the third boss. Oh my god, so much damage, but if you dodge all the spores and you kill all the mushrooms, another target dummy. Even the last boss that looks very scary is all about mechanics. Just stack on your tank, clean your debuff, dodge the frontal, and that's it. So long story short, if this dungeon looks hard to you, just learn the mechanics and then you have a pretty good time here, ranking this as one of the easy dungeons this season so far. It didn't seem to be the case in the beginning with 5 bosses and the longest timer in the dungeon pool this season, but the Udaman shapes out to be not only one of the easy dungeons but one of the fun ones as well. There are a few interesting trash mechanics, but most of the mobs you can do this huge fun pools, which speeds up the dungeon significantly. It's not gonna be that easy on 4 to 5 weeks, but you can still skip some of the trash and separate it into smaller pools to manage the dungeon easier. Apart from the first boss, the other 4 bosses in this dungeon could present some quite significant challenges, both for healers and DPS, especially on higher keys. But there's nothing that feels unmanageable in here, so if you need to spam keys or you want to do higher pushes, that's definitely one of your targets. And at the end we have what shapes to be the easiest dungeon this year, Freehold, which is the only dungeon that actually get a buff instead of a nerf, or as they said, a fix that gave the last boss a few extra abilities. You should not underestimate the dungeon, however, because there are a few mobs in the trash that do heavy AoE damage throughout the whole dungeon, and the bosses do have mechanics that can one-shot people and eventually lead to a wipe. Also, keep in mind that probably the biggest challenge in this dungeon is at the end the last boss Halan, which is the one that actually got the buffs. So even though the timer seems to be relatively free in this dungeon, even with a wipe or 2, you should stay focused up until the very end, until the key is actually timed. The dungeon itself though is quite fun to play, it drops a mount. So if you're looking to just have some fun, run keys for the count, or push to the highest possible level, this is probably the place to go to. So that's pretty much it for that first week. Things will definitely change next week when we'll probably see one of the new affixes and it's going to be fortified instead of tyrannical. But do let me know if you agree with this ranking and do let me know how the dungeons feels for you in the comments below. Cheers to Blizzard for introducing what seems to be a very fun season, good luck in your keys, and I'll see you in Azeroth.